Hello, my dear friend. Welcome to the Reflective Parenting Podcast. My name is Cindy Hovington and I am your host. I am a mom of three from Montreal, Canada, and I have a PhD in neuroscience. And my goal with this podcast, as well as the company that I'm founder of called Curious Neuron, is to make sure that we start placing a little bit more focus on the parent. I believe in a world where we show up at our kids' doctor's appointments and they ask us how we're doing as well. Because when we're not well, it is much harder for us to support our children. Part of that mission and dream that I have is starting to come true. We have finally launched our pilot project where we are in a few clinics in the US, in Canada, and one in Kenya, where we are partnering with pediatric clinics, psychologist clinics, OT, and SLP clinics that are focused on pediatrics so that when a parent is truly struggling to support their child in emotion regulation skills, they can refer Curious Neuron and refer them to our program called the Reflective Parent Club. And so I'm so happy and thrilled that this is starting to happen. If you have a question about that or you want to join our new program and clinical partnership program, you can email me at info@curiousneuron.com. All right, today is one of my favorite episodes. I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Carolyn Fleck. And if you've never heard of her, I hope that she continues to grow in terms of her book success and this topic, validation. The validation is something that many of us did not experience growing up, right? Think about the simplest thing. I see it now. My three kids play soccer. And just yesterday, actually, one of my kids got hurt. And the coach, the young guy who's the coach said, okay, you're fine. You're fine. Get up. Let's go. I know that most of us were raised that way where it's like, just if you don't put too much attention to it, it'll, they'll get over it. They won't cry as much. There's some truth to that, sort of. However, if you are continuously not validating part of what your child is experiencing, there are some heavy negative consequences to invalidation, as you will hear at the end of this episode, where I will share two very important studies. And so that is why validation was an important topic for me to cover. So I don't want to wait any longer. It's not a longer episode, but I really encourage you to listen to this whole thing. It's just so important. So I'd like to thank the Tannenbaum Open Science Institute as well as the McConnell Foundation for supporting this podcast. I'd also like to thank you. If you are listening on Apple, on Spotify, please take a moment to rate the podcast if you've been listening to it. And if not, you can do that at the end if you're happy with this episode. But more importantly, thank you for subscribing to this podcast, either on these platforms or also on YouTube. You can watch it on YouTube if you want. And we are seeing a growth of this podcast, and I'm grateful for that. So keep sharing it with your colleagues. This particular episode, I truly encourage you to share it with your partner. I encourage you to share it with your brother and your sister if they have kids, and cousins and friends, colleagues. It is just such an important episode. All right, so Dr. Carolyn Fleck is a licensed psychologist, corporate consultant, and an adjunct clinical instructor at Stanford University. She is a respected voice in psychology and has been featured in national media outlets, including the New York Times, Good Morning America, and the Huffington Post. Carolyn is a world-renowned expert in validation, and her new book, Validation: How the Skill Set That Revolutionized Psychology Will Transform Your Relationships, Increase Your Influence, and Change Your Life, has now been translated in 9 different languages. I am so honored that she sat down with me and had a conversation, and there's a lot to learn. So grab your notebook and listen to this once or twice or 3 times. And I will see you on the other side. I will pause in the middle of our conversation to share some reflection prompts with you so that you can truly dive deeper into this conversation and this topic and gain awareness around validation in your life. I'll see you on the other side. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Reflective Parenting Podcast. And as promised in the intro, I'm here with Dr. Carolyn Fleck. Welcome, Carolyn.
Thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
I'm so happy that you are here. I read your book, Validation, and I think that it's one of those books that a parent might not think of as a parenting book because it doesn't say parenting on it. It doesn't
Mhm,
have that in the
mhm.
title. But it's one of those. So here at Curious Neuron, we believe in building skills, and validation is one of those skill sets that I think we just don't talk enough about as a society, and
Yeah,
especially with parents. So
yeah.
before we get into our conversation that I'm really excited about, how I always want to kind of understand a little bit more about how this book came about and what were the seeds that were planted earlier that led to this.
Yeah, yeah. So I remember learning about validation. So I was trained as a dialectical behavior therapist, a DBT therapist, very specific type of therapy. And this was, well over a decade ago. I was in graduate school working towards my doctorate, learning this treatment, and I was introduced to this set of skills for communicating validation. And validation is just another way of saying, I see you, I hear you. I
Right.
could define it more, but that was the
Yeah.
essence of it, right?
Mm.
And I remember sitting in that lecture and thinking, why don't we teach this in grade school? Like,
Hmm.
why did it take me getting a PhD and then mastering a very like niche specific treatment to be
Hmm.
introduced to skills that will absolutely serve me and have served me in
Exactly.
every single relationship I have, including the
Mm.
one with myself. So
Mm.
really, the seeds for this book were really early on,
Mm.
and it just took me some time to get there.
But it takes time, and that's okay, because with the
Yes,
time comes more of your knowledge and
that's
experience
right.
and speaking with people. So there's
That's right.
it's needed. I completely agree with you. And I think that in terms of validation, not only is it a skill that we need, but it also makes me think of mindfulness in the sense that I don't think we
Yes.
all understand exactly what it is. So I want to make
Yes.
sure that everybody listening to this is on the same page in terms of what we're talking about.
Yeah. So I've got a really simple, easy to remember definition, which is that validation simply shows that you're there, you get it, and you care. The more
Mm.
like technical definition is that validation is simply a means of communicating mindfulness,
Hmm.
understanding, and empathy such that another person feels seen in some part of their
Mm.
experience. All right. So
Right.
that's it. Yeah.
But your simple definition, so you're there, you care, and you said something else. What's the
You're
third one?
there, you get it, and you
I
care.
get
So
right. That
mindfulness,
is a good one.
understanding, empathy.
Mm,
Yeah. Those are
I
the notes you're
absolutely love
trying to
that.
hit. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that having it in that way in our minds helps us because so I've had a discussion with we were with couples and we were talking about validation in terms of validating our children's emotions. So here at Kirsten on, we focus on emotion regulation for parents and how they support their child learning the skill. But what's interesting is when we were talking about emotion regulation skills and the importance of validating, somebody said, but validating is just saying that I agree with everything that you did, right? Validating is saying like my perspective doesn't matter. I'm just giving in to whatever it is. And they were talking about the relationship with their child, but also in terms of a couple. If I validate what you're saying, that I'm saying I agree with you. What would you say to somebody who says this to you?
Oh, I have so many things just came up as you were talking, in part because this has been such an obstacle to our
Mm,
understanding of something that, in my opinion, is as fundamental as trust to a
mm,
relationship. That is how critical validation is. And it is not agreement. I can validate why somebody would choose to eat meat, even though I myself am a vegetarian. All
mm,
right. I see plenty of valid reasons why. And if I wanted to validate somebody, I could speak to that very
right.
genuinely, very
Mm,
non judgmentally. All right. So it is not agreement. And it's also not praise. It's also not a positive judgment, like, good job or your performance was great. It communicates acceptance independent of praise. It says, I accept who
mm.
you are, independent of how you look or perform. So it's pretty distinct, I think, from how we often talk about it in terms of like external validation being bad and all that.
So what again, I maybe start with our child, right? So if we see the
Mhm.
child in front of us having a huge meltdown, I think that there was an article that you wrote online, I read somewhere, and you said this phrase, validate the valid, I believe.
Mm. Mhm.
Right. And so I think that helps us also because I want to create different scenarios so that a parent coming out of this conversation really sees
Yes.
how it's applying to literally every moment of our day, right? Interactions with their
Mhm.
child, with our partner, and even with ourselves. And we're going to get to
Yes,
that because that
yes,
one's the
yes.
really important one. But you see this child having big emotions, and then we're going to think validate. Can you walk us through what we should be thinking in that moment? Because again, I think we're stuck in old patterns of, I need to say like, okay, it's okay for you to be mad because I said no to the cookie. Now what? Right? Or I'm just going to ignore my child.
Yeah, so I'm actually
Yeah.
glad that you went right for the trickiest type of dynamic with our kids, which is when they are
Yeah.
tantruming.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to be very clear with parents, because as parents, we get this like so many competing messages that it's like,
Right.
what the heck should I be doing? So I shouldn't give
Right.
them attention, but I should validate, like, what the heck?
Mm-hmm.
Let me be clear. Let me be clear. Attention can be reinforcing. If a child is melting down, leaning in with, it makes total sense that you're upset, and I would be upset too if I were you, that could function to escalate it. My
Mm.
daughter, when she was younger, I don't know if anyone else's kids do this, but she would like start to cry, and then she'd see herself in the mirror and start crying harder. Like really, she would like really work
Yeah.
herself up. She needed to be distracted. Okay. So I
Yeah.
needed to orient her towards like self-soothing, or I might have needed to ignore some of the outbursts.
Mm-hmm.
However, I always circle back to validate some part of her experience. And the problem with the tantrum behavior is that the reaction, the behavior, is usually not valid, in that it's not effective, it's not helping the
Mm-hmm.
kid, it's not helping the relationship. However, their emotions, or at least some degree of their emotions, it's reasonable to be disappointed or frustrated, especially if we factor in the fact that they hadn't eaten or slept or whatever.
Right.
So what I do with the child who has tantrumed is I get through the storm, and then I circle back to say, and I do this little thing where I say, like, what happened for you in that discussion? Once they've calmed down and everyone's regulated, including myself, what's happened for you? And I get their very distorted version of events in which I am depicted in their telling as like a cartoon with steam coming out of its ears, right? And as they're talking, I'm just looking for what's valid here. As humans, we tend to stream for what we disagree with, what we don't like, what's wrong. And I'm flipping that on its head. So I'm looking for, okay, I can see where she would have felt disappointed. And then that's what I speak to. I see. It makes sense that you were disappointed in that moment. You were expecting to get the cookie. We had talked about it. And then all of a sudden you weren't getting it. That's really frustrating. That's not me saying I agree with how you handled it. And in fact, we can talk about that. But we have this moment in which I directly label and validate her emotions. And here's why. Because I want her to be able to do the same thing for herself.
Mm-hmm.
When she feels upset, disappointed, whatever else she's going to experience in her life, I don't want her first reaction to be, I should dismiss that. That's wrong. That was bad.
Right.
I do want her to think about what she might be able to do differently in that situation, but I don't want her instinct to be to invalidate herself. So we have to model the alternative.
I want to dig a little bit deeper in what you just said. I'm just so excited to get into the self part, but I need to dig a little deeper, because you talk about this in your book where, so there's an experience and then you can validate the emotion. I might have this wrong, but the emotion, the thought, or the behavior. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think having this sort of idea in our minds helps us see that I don't agree with your behavior, but I understand and I can validate the emotion behind it, right? What does that look like?
So glad you like narrowed in on that, because that was one of the greatest gifts I got through my training as in becoming a psychologist, was just this little piece of wisdom that a person's thoughts might be valid in that they're logical, even if their behavior isn't. You know, they are they're upset that somebody stole something from them. That's logical. Killing that person's dog, that behavior is not valid. That's not a logic. That's not a reasonable reaction to the trigger. So a person's thoughts might be valid. Their emotions might be valid, and or their behavior could be valid. But most of the time when we're struggling with people, be it partners, kids, whomever, it's because we're really focused on which of those is invalid. You know, the fact that they think that way. How could they think that way? What idiots, right? We're really honed in on that, as opposed to, well, no wonder they voted the way they did based on what they're thinking, based on what they've been told and what they believe. That makes sense, right? So As someone who works with folks whose thoughts are often severely distorted and whose behavior is often very ineffective to the point of being dangerous, I
Mm,
had to become a ninja at basically slicing through, all the information that was coming at me and finding the kernel of truth and then
mm,
speaking to that. Because when you focus on that, especially when folks are expecting you to point out everything that's wrong and they're ready to get
mhm,
into it, when you do this other thing, it just takes all of the tension out of the conversation.
mm,
People's guards come down. I'm really hopeful that your listeners will experiment with some version of it because it's the closest thing to a superpower I've witnessed or experienced. Just this
mm.
ability to neutralize conflict, to see yourself in another person, and then be seen by them when you least expected it. That's kind of what validation can facilitate.
So you're kind of touching on what I wanted to follow up with. Why is validation so powerful, right? And I think of that we have a membership where parents, it's called the Reflective Parent Club, and we have weekly calls where we just talk about situations that we were in. And oftentimes when somebody talks about an argument that they had with a partner, it's almost as if the moment your experience is validated, or I've never seen it broken up the way you said, so now I have
Yeah,
this new perspective on it. But
yeah.
some part of it, the emotion, right? Like I understand why you're so frustrated and so overwhelmed with this new baby. Let's use that as an
Mhm,
example.
mhm.
Just being validated by their partner, it's almost as if it makes things magically disappear in a sense, in a
It
moment,
does.
right? What's the psychology behind that, or like the reason why is validation so powerful?
It's really interesting what it does to us physiologically. So it pretty much operates as like a sedative in that we
Mm,
know through experimental research, we know that when we invalidate people, right, and they run these really all sorts of weird trials where they stress people out and then invalidate them in the process,
mm,
the individual's sympathetic nervous system just continues to get more activated, right? They
mm,
really flip their lid. That's what invalidation does. On the
mm,
contrary, if in moments of high distress, high conflict, you validate someone, you will see a reduction in things like heart rate, galvanic skin response, these indicators of
mm.
how distressed we are. So it's like slipping someone a little Valium in the middle of a conversation. Like, I don't want to be too
Right, but it
extreme with it,
feels,
but
yeah. There's a, yeah,
that's what's happening. Like what I'm
yeah.
observing when I say like it really just neutralizes thing physiologically, that's what happened. That's what's happening is that it's really, and here's what's critical in arguments, be it with kids or partners, the more distressed or dysregulated someone is, the harder it is for them to hear you, right?
Right.
They are so like their ability to remember and concentrate and all
Mm,
those like higher cognitive faculties
mm,
are shut down the
mm,
more dysregulated you get. And so they're not listening and you guys aren't dialoguing. So anything that can reverse that will facilitate conversation and dialogue and
mm.
collaboration. I know I make it
It's
sound so easy.
amazing.
It's
No,
yeah, it's a lot.
well, we're gonna get to that, right? Because I do
Mhm.
want parents listening to have some sort of advice and tips. Your book, by the way, is gonna, somebody who's
Mm.
listening. I mean, I'm gonna put the link in the show notes for Canada and US. I do think that you need to walk through this book slowly and take notes and reflect on how you can apply
Yeah.
that, because it's a skill. It's a skill
Mhm.
set, and so like you said a few times now, I think naturally we kind of see the negative. And so seeing the
Yeah.
positive is going to be really hard. It's not going to happen tomorrow. What are, I guess maybe since we're talking about that, like what are the baby steps that help us start understanding how to validate somebody? Maybe the language, or how do we begin this?
Yeah. So again, I mentioned it. Validation includes those qualities of mindfulness, understanding, and empathy. Now, this has been translated pretty much into like a science. Okay.
Mm,
So, when I was learning how to validate, again, in the context of this treatment with folks who are really hard to treat with very distorted thoughts or behaviors, I was taught you open with these first two mindfulness skills. You practice what we call attending and copying. All right.
mm,
So if I really don't get where the other person is coming from, I don't empathize, I don't understand, I can at the very least copy by literally repeating some keywords that they have said, copying their body language. Okay.
mm,
And
mm,
I can attend by, listening in a specific way that I describe in the book. By using just these two skills, I will cultivate a deeper understanding and perhaps even empathy,
Mm,
because that is what those skills are designed to do. Copying activates mirror neurons, which allows us
mm,
to actually feel some piece of what the other person is feeling. And so I am using these skills as stepping stones to enable me to perhaps validate at a higher level by communicating understanding or empathy in a
mm,
specific way. So you're right, like we break it down into like there's these 8 skills you can learn and you've got to learn them. The real task becomes how do you move between them? How do you
mm.
use them in concert? That is the skill. Because otherwise, you're going to look at this stuff and you're going to go self disclosure. I know what that is. I know how to do that. And that is an
Yeah.
empathy skill. It's a great way to validate somebody. But you got to know how to get there, when to use it, and how, again, to kind of like use these skills collectively and move between them. That's where the real quote unquote skill comes.
Right. And it takes time. I just want to remind everybody
Does,
that it's going to
does.
take time and practice, but put yourself in those situations and start, right? Like start with small steps.
Yeah.
You know, we get these patterns that we're stuck in. I see that with parents in terms of learning how to regulate their emotions. Self-compassion
Mm,
is extremely hard for many parents. And
mhm.
so you've touched on the self piece, and
Yeah.
in terms of parents, the parents that come into Curious Neuron, we have them answer parental competence scale, and how
Mm,
they see themselves in terms of their level of competence, and 40% score low. And so what that tells us, and what that tells me is
mm,
we often don't think we are competent enough to be a parent, but here we are with this newborn
yeah,
and this toddler.
yeah, yeah.
Where does validation fit into this? Because again, they struggle with self-compassion. So what do we need to work on in terms of our inner dialogue to bring in the validation piece?
So this is a little complicated. There's 2
Mm,
pieces there. First, I need the individual, and sometimes that individual is myself as a parent. I
mm,
need to be able to see, why am I feeling guilty right now? Like,
mm,
what's the validity in that? Where's that coming from? Well, frankly, we live in a culture that is bombarding us with information about all the things that we're doing wrong. We have competing
mhm,
messages. I'm supposed to be validating my kid, but not reinforcing them, but this and that.
mhm.
I'm supposed to be working full time and full time parenting.
Right, and
Like,
even taking a break, there's guilt around
oh, yeah.
pausing,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Like a
How can,
lot.
I mean, a lot, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, it makes sense that I feel guilty
Mm,
given all of that. Okay. That doesn't necessarily mean I've done wrong. And I need to be able to see, like, why I'm feeling this way. Okay. To begin to transform it. So, on the one hand, I'm looking at it makes total sense that I feel, you know, incompetent. Okay. And if I am feeling guilt and shame and whatever else, what would I do for somebody else in that
mm,
situation? Would I beat them over the head with more resources for them to read? Would I tell them they're bad, they don't deserve to have a child, or whatever else you're telling
mm,
yourself in your head? You would not do that.
mm-mm,
You would never do that. And so you need to be able to do the opposite for yourself, which is that self-soothing, self-compassion. It hurts to feel this way. I understand where this is coming from. And even though I see all of the crap that leads into this, I'm still feeling guilty. And that's a
mm,
horrible way to feel. And it's confusing. And so it's just this like inner dialogue
mm.
that's
Right.
challenging the critic that is otherwise like narrating our lives.
And it gets loud sometimes, I think, for many
Most
parents.
times.
It's so
Yeah.
it's so loud.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I think that with what you described in terms of even just that interaction between us and our child, that validating piece, right? That volume, that kind of release, we can do
Mhm.
it to ourselves. I don't think we realize how powerful it could be. If somebody's listening to this saying, I know, I don't even think, I mean, I've spoken to some parents who say, I can very easily support my best friend and telling them like,
Yeah,
look, you're
yeah,
not a bad parent. It's okay. Like you messed up, you yelled, it's
yeah.
okay, but they really struggle with flipping that, on themselves. So where do
Mhm.
we begin? Again, I know it's the inner dialogue, but how can we apply some of the work that you've suggested in your book to ourselves?
Yeah, yeah. So I have this whole self-compassion, process that I can describe, but I also wanna make the case just based on my own experience, which was that like, okay, I learned these skills to validate other people in the context of my work as a therapist. That was my job. And it was in practicing this every day for other people that I became able to turn it inward. Like, I
Mm,
genuinely don't know if I would have become as adept at self-validation as I became, were it not for the fact that I was focused on doing it for other people. Because we don't think about how we talk to ourselves, right? But we're very mindful of how we talk to others.
yeah.
And if you start to get in the habit of searching for validity in communication with others, you will turn it on yourself for sure. For sure.
Okay, so something just came up now too. So
Mm.
hold on, I want to, there's, because I think one thing I want to bring up is when parents talk about their thoughts, it's often their thoughts are perceived as facts. I wonder if that plays a part too, right? Where we often say like I'm a bad parent or I'm messed up or I'm, whatever negative,
Mm.
thoughts we have.
So for it to be validation, it has this mindfulness quality, which is innately non-judgmental. So I'm a
Mm,
bad parent. That's a judgment. So I
mm,
would say translate that into a fact. Like translate that into something indisputable. Like I forgot my child's lunch. I forgot to pack
right.
lunch for
Okay.
my kid. All right, that's a behavior. All right, that's
Right.
concrete. That is light years away from I am a bad parent. And
Mm,
so part of
mm,
like looking for validity in what you're experiencing is like checking the facts. So like I'm feeling guilty and I feel like I'm a bad parent. Let me explore whether or not that's true. Well,
got
there's
it.
validity to I can see why I would feel that way based on the culture and everything else, but when I check the facts, I just forgot lunch. Like that is not synonymous with being a bad parent. I'm making a
Right.
pretty big leap there. So
Yeah.
yes, this
We do.
emphasis
Yeah.
on
Got it.
mindfulness and objectivity is the piece I think you're speaking to.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I was wondering how that would apply. So, in terms of the steps that you have, can you share those with us?
So I tend to practice self-validation at night before I go to
Oh,
bed. What was I thinking about last night, the last couple nights? Oh, yeah, there it is. My daughter was asking, did I want to read to her or should her dad read? And it was my turn to read. We switch off reading. And I said, why don't you have your dad do it? And then lying in bed at night, I was playing the tape of I'm such a bad parent.
mm,
I care more about my career than my kid because I
mm.
was
It
working on
gave you
something.
time to work. Yeah,
That
I've
and
done that. Yeah.
oh, and let's be really gross. The thing I was working on, this is so bad, was like a TikTok video.
No, but it's part of our work.
It's part of
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
It's like, are you going to read to me? And
Yeah.
I'm like, have your
Oh,
dad do it. I got to get
yeah.
on TikTok, like, oh my God. And I was like, oh, this is so bad.
And then
Okay.
the guilt comes. I get
Oh, it's
that. I
so
get
bad.
that.
It's so
Yeah.
bad. So the first thing I do in this process, and the first thing anyone should do toward if you're trying to validate yourself, you've got to first identify the emotion.
Hmm.
You got to notice where in your body you feel it and you label it. So for me, that feeling was guilt.
Mm,
Okay. And I can find where I feel it in my body. And then I do this wacky thing, which is to repeat the emotion, almost like a mantra. This is
mm,
guilt. This is guilt. And I'm repeating it over and over again while trying to feel it as intensely as I can, which sounds totally backwards. Okay. But here's the thing, if you're not feeding that emotion with the narrative, like if I'm sitting there thinking about, oh my gosh, and like I don't even have many TikTok followers, and like here I am prioritizing this over my kid, like what's wrong with me? I'm going to feel more guilt.
sure.
But if I
Mm,
just try and feel that emotion in my body, if I just
mm,
focus on it, don't feed it, no thoughts, just feel it, wring it out like a sponge, you
mm,
will notice it come up and come down. It absolutely will if you don't feed it. And as soon as you feel that kind of climax and it's coming down, then you look for what's the validity in this? Where's this coming from? And that's where I can say, should I feel guilt? Well, no, I see why I do based on the culture, but me choosing to work on a video one night is not gonna more like, deeply scar my child. I could do something different tomorrow, okay? So I just basically look for what's the validity in what I'm feeling, what's true here,
I get that. Mm,
and then I self-soothe. So I look at, like, I've got this guilt, like we said, how would I treat a friend in this situation? Since I'm lying in bed, I'll often just, like, rub my chest, put a hand to my heart, say you're doing your best. You can change what you do tomorrow. Um, and then the last step of that process, which I really believe in, is that you've got to do something productive with that emotion. So if it was during the day, I might, get up and go read to her. Since I often do this at night, for me, I often do like a loving kindness meditation, which is what I did. So
I love that.
those are kind of the steps. Yeah.
And it doesn't take much time to address it that way. And I think that at
Mm-mm.
least it kind of, we're not bottling it in, right? I feel that we
Mm-hmm.
kind of keep, and this is why parents are telling me like they're feeling burnt out, they're overwhelmed, they're stressed. I think we're putting all this on our shoulders and we're never thinking of an outlet, right? And what you
Yeah.
explained is the outlet for this. These moments
Yeah.
will happen, maybe once, maybe twice, maybe 3 times during our day. But what you're explaining is address it. Don't just let it pile up inside because
Yeah.
it does get overwhelming.
And more importantly, and perhaps maybe controversially, you don't need someone else there to
Yes.
process that. I mean, and I'm saying this as a therapist, like this
Mm,
is my whole work is being there for folks in this way.
mm,
But ultimately, if you can validate
mm,
yourself, I don't need someone else telling me I'm a good parent or I'm okay or they did the same thing or who cares. Like that's nice, but I don't need it in the
mm.
same way that I would if I couldn't do that for myself.
That's an important point because I'm realizing
Yeah.
now that maybe somebody's listening to that saying, I actually need somebody outside to validate me. And maybe this is foreign to them, right? They've never validated themselves.
And that's okay. Like if you don't have that self-validation
Mm,
practice yet, that's okay. And I should
mm,
add that even though I have the self-validation practice, it does still feel good to get it from other
right.
people. I don't want to give the message that you shouldn't seek external validation by all means. However, if you can do it, if you can provide that to yourself, it does release some of that like need, that drive, that desperation. That, yeah.
All right. Let's take a short pause from this conversation I had with Dr. Carolyn Fleck to really think about how this applies to our lives. So many of the parents that I speak with tell me that they or their experiences were never validated growing up. And that now that they have a child, sometimes it's even hard to figure out which aspect of this am I validating. And if I don't know how to recognize the emotions in myself and I don't know how to regulate, then I don't know how to even recognize the emotion in my child. I see the anger, but I don't see the shame or the guilt or the sadness that's behind the anger. I just see the behavior. And so, what's important for us to kind of reflect on is first building the awareness, right? So, she talks about how the first step to change is awareness. If you are somebody listening to this, and I know that there are some because I've seen them inside the Reflective Parent Club, every single new member that joins the Reflective Parent Club, I take 30 minutes to have a one on one with them and to get to know them. And I hear all of their stories and I love hearing their stories. And many of them are struggling with the awareness. I've had moms and dads tell me, I don't know what it feels like to be dysregulated, or I don't have a really big vocabulary around my emotions because I was never taught this. And so try to notice the moments where you could have validated some aspect, either of your child's experience or your partner's experience. And if you start noticing after the fact, in retrospect, oh, yeah, I had an argument with my partner today and I didn't validate any aspect of their experience. And like Carolyn said, we are validating the valid, right? So if our partner is mad or upset about something, the anger could be valid, but the reason or their actions or their behavior might not be valid. And so we have to really take the time to think about that. And I think that many of us have a lot to learn around this. So I have 3 different reflections that I'd love to share with you. One is about the self, one is about partner, and one is about us and our child that will help you kind of gain a bit of awareness around what validation looks like in these different relationships. So the one about self-validation, the reflection prompt is, and by the way, I encourage you, if you are a new listener here for this podcast, I encourage you to start a notebook. Start a notebook and write down these reflections because I will continue to share them every single week. It's not just about education. If you have been listening to this podcast, you've seen the shift because I was providing you with content and education. But now that we've launched the Reflective Parent Club with the idea that education is not enough, You need to build awareness. And the only way to build awareness is if you have somebody to bounce these experiences with, bounce them off of and talk about it and then hear it reflected back to you. That's when you start to say, oh, wow, I should have said that a little differently, or I could have acted a little differently with my child. So start your, whatever you want to call it, Curious Neuron Notebook or Reflective Parenting Notebook. But here are the prompts. So the self validation is, do I confuse a mistake or forgotten task, for example, forgetting your child's lunchbox, with being a bad parent? What's the fact versus the judgment? And by reflecting on your week and noticing one of these, maybe you will notice that you often label yourself or you catastrophize a certain event. And we have activities, and part of our course inside the Reflective Parent Club focuses on these biased thoughts that we have. The next reflection prompt is around you or your partner. When my partner shares something stressful, do I jump into problem solving or pause to validate their feelings first? I'm going to repeat that one because it's an important one. When my partner shares something stressful, do I jump into problem solving or pause to validate their feelings first? It really is important because if we're often jumping into problem solving, the person it might come from a good place. I'm not saying that this is wrong, but the person on the other end of this might be saying, I actually didn't want to solve this right now. I just want to be validated. Like, I want you to validate that this was a really shitty experience and I'm really upset about this, whatever happened at work, let's say. And so take the time to validate that. It feels so good to be validated. There is something so soothing to our nervous system when we are validated. And maybe you weren't validated growing up, but it doesn't mean that you can't start doing it now. You're going to see there's a study that I'm going to share at the end of this episode that talks about how hard it could be, but also the consequences of a child feeling invalidated. We're going to talk about that. But one more reflection prompt for you, and then we're going to get back to my conversation with Dr. Carolyn Fleck. This one is about your child. When my child has a meltdown or emotional reaction, do I focus more on correcting their behavior or helping them feel seen first? These reflection prompts are so important around this topic. And like I said at the beginning of this episode, this is one of my favorite episodes because of how important validation is and how little we know about validation and how little we apply it in our lives. And we don't know yet the impact that validating will have on not only our well-being, but our relationships around us, including the one with our child. I have a very special thought activity. So these are some of the reflections as you hear. But what we do inside the Reflective Parent Club is we're going to take this even deeper and apply this to our lives so that we can take what we learned from Carolyn Fleck and truly make a difference in our lives. And so if you're a parent listening to this saying, hey, I have no idea what validation looks like. And even if I'm thinking back to the last situation with my child, I don't know what to validate or how to speak that language. Come join us inside the Reflective Parent Club. It is our Curious Neuron program. You have access to a full course, all focused on emotional intelligence, 4 pillars of emotional intelligence that are tailored to you as a parent. This is for parents to help you learn how to cope with emotions, because if you don't know how to cope with yours, you will struggle to show your child how to cope with theirs. And by the way, like one of our dads realized, he said, my wife's dysregulated because she yells a lot. I'm not. But now he realized that sometimes there's dysregulation with low energy, and that looks like shutting down. And so many parents are gaining insight and awareness into what regulation is and what that looks like and how many things in our environment dysregulate us. And so you can click the link in the show notes, take the 7-day trial to come in, book a call with me right away. When you join, you get access to everything, by the way, but I send you an email that has 3 very important scales. One of the assessments is something that I built myself that gives you perspective into how dysregulation impacts various aspects of your lives. If you want to take those, take the 7-day free trial and then meet with me. I'll talk about your results with you and then give you a path that you can take inside the club. It's one course, one huge course that takes you 3 months to work on, 15 minutes a week or 30 minutes a week. And then you meet with me every single week, an hour a week for your mental health and your well-being as a parent is not much. And you get to share experiences and learn and dig deeper from these podcast episodes to keep building your awareness. So I'll see you inside the club. And after, at the end of the episode, I'll share 2 really important research studies that I think all parents should know about. And in the show notes, you also have the link to the blog post that I wrote about it, summarizing all of this together. So I'll see you on the other side. Bye. I just think it's so important to realize the impact of that. So I made a list here. I was going through your book and I wrote the positive changes from validation, and you list them in your book. So improved relationships, decreased conflict, increased influence, increased ability to drive behavior change, increased self-compassion. I mean, it's so powerful. But now I want to flip this towards invalidation, right? If we're stuck in this pattern, maybe your child is stuck in a pattern where we're not validating. Maybe we're stuck in a relationship where we don't feel validated, and maybe we're not validating. And then with ourselves, right? This becomes very heavy. What do we know from research or the work that you've done? What is the outcome of invalidation and on somebody's well-being?
Invalidation is directly correlated with some of the most severe forms of psychopathology we know of. Okay, so folks with borderline personality disorder, for instance, self-harm, suicidality, they are significantly more likely to come from environments in which they were pervasively invalidated. You know, whatever they said they felt or thought was just dismissed or challenged. You know, you liked it. It's a common kind of invalidating statement.
Right.
If we even look at demographics, groups of people who are invalidated, let's take like the LGBTQ plus community, where folks who are frequently subjected to messages that there's something wrong with them. They're not okay as they are. Again, we see significantly higher rates of self-harm, suicidality, and on and on. This is not something we can take lightly. Or even at this point, we can't afford to not understand what this concept is or what's going on here, because it is at the core of so many of our problems and our societal issues as well.
In relationships, I hear about this a lot through friends, through the parents we work with here. The invalidation piece feels like it destroys the relationship. It feels like that one piece of saying I need help and not hearing, like, you know, it's as if you're not doing enough, or having a new baby, right? And you feel like you do nothing all day, but then you're being told that. There's so much that happens. If somebody's listening to this saying, I see this as a very prominent problem within my relationship, how do you start the conversation with a partner who might not see the importance of this? Or maybe that they themselves don't feel validated. Maybe you're 2 people that don't feel validated. How do you begin this conversation?
So it's a really good question. So I think it starts with just like, let's get on the same page about what this means. And I think you're actually right. Folks who invalidate frequently were frequently invalidated themselves, right? This is like, we speak the language we were spoken to. And so that makes sense.
Yeah.
It also means then that, like, that's not going to be a strong skill set. Even, and this is important. Oh, this is like explosive, but even if you're emotionally intelligent, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're great at validating other people or yourself. That's a big mistake.
That's a big one.
Yeah, folks assume
that's going to be a quote.
Yeah. Oh, golly.
That's a good one.
Oh,
that's a good one.
people are coming for me.
But it's so important. But it's true.
It's true. It's true. It's true. So let's just look at this as something like assertiveness. If you weren't very assertive, what would you do? You would maybe read a couple books. You would develop those skills. You would recognize that there's ways to improve on that. It's the exact same thing. So if you don't have those skills, or your partner doesn't, we've got a whole science that can show you how to develop it. Like, these resources are there, or at least I'm trying to make them more available. But you're going to probably need to develop some skills. Yeah.
I get that. And the conversation has to happen. It's not something that you want to let slide, you know, because like I said, I see the impact on the other end. I'm not a therapist. I'm just hearing from parents. And it's interesting because parents come to Kirsten on saying, like, I don't know how to support my child with their behavior. but the conversation becomes, how are they regulating their emotions? How is their partner regulating their emotions? And what's the environment like? And the environment, when it changes, it impacts and influences the child. And so that's why we do the work that we do here. I'm assuming the same thing happens with validation in terms of the
Yes.
environment. Yeah.
Parents are also particularly susceptible to self-validation when kids are acting out, because it feels like that's a reflection on the parent.
Yeah.
My kid isn't doing well in X, Y, or
Mm-hmm.
Z, therefore I'm not a good parent. And
Right.
that gets knotted up in the dynamic. Like, that's part of what we're reacting to when our kid acts out, is like
Mm,
the way it makes us feel or how it reflects on us, which isn't
mm,
always great.
mm.
So again, like having that perspective on like, this is how I'm feeling, this is where it's coming from. That is the first step. I mean, awareness is the first step to change. It just
Right.
is. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, it's exactly that. And I think that's why your book is so helpful, because maybe somebody will pick this up and say, I think I'm okay. I think I validate people's feelings and
Mm,
emotions. And then they're going to realize that there's so much more to it than just that, right? Like, because I
there is,
think that's
yeah.
where we get stuck as parents, especially with this, positive parenting movement or conscious parenting
Mhm.
movement. I think we are
Yes.
stuck, right? Can we speak about that for 1 second? Because
Yes.
I say this so often, where I think there's been a misunderstanding of what that is. And it's about just validating the emotion, and then the behavior should go away. But you explained it very well
Mm.
at the beginning, but can we touch on that one more time? Because it's not just about saying like, it's okay for you to feel sad. There's a lot more to it.
No, in fact, the research is very clear on this. Okay, so setting limits, having rules
Mm-hmm.
is
Mm-hmm.
part of effective parenting. It's part of raising an emotionally intelligent child.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I don't work with many kids who are free of rules and are really well behaved.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
It is about having reasonable expectations, limits, rules, but then also rooting for your kid. Like,
Mm,
I'm hoping they're going to make the right decision. And when they
right.
don't, I'm not like, I told you so, you suck. I'm
Yeah.
like, oh man, it was right
Yeah.
there and we missed it.
Yeah.
Yep, there's still going to be this consequence. And yep, I understand your emotions got away from you,
Mm,
but we got to do different next time. So I focus on like validating the valid, which may be their thoughts or their emotions, but working on changing what's ineffective. That's called parenting, right?
mm-hmm.
You can't
Right.
you can't just not acknowledge what's actively hurting a kid or their relationships or their progress in some capacity.
Right. I see it as this sort of pendulum, and there's like
Yeah,
authoritarian parenting, which is what many of us were raised with, where
yeah,
there's no validation of anything. There's just
yeah,
nothing was validated in terms of my experiences
yes,
growing up. And then the
yes.
pendulum to the other end is permissive parenting. And I feel
Hmm.
that parents are really struggling to figure out, like, where's the middle ground? Like, it's going to swing. I think about like every day, if you're tired, there's going to be more threats, get to bed or else.
Yes,
Like
yes,
it
yes, yes,
happens,
yes.
right?
It does. Yeah.
And then there's days where you're sick and you're tired, and so it swings to the other end of permissive parenting. It's like, you know what, do whatever you want. You
Yes,
want,
yes,
the whole tub of ice cream, have it, it's fine. I'm tired, I'm
yes,
not cooking
yeah,
dinner tonight.
yeah,
But then it's so hard to find the middle ground sometimes for some parents, because the parents I
yeah,
speak with, they were raised so in such a strict environment with no emotional support, and so they want to
yeah.
do the opposite, but then the opposite ends up being permissive. And then,
Yes.
so it's really hard to find a balance for a lot of parents.
It's both
But
and.
yeah,
It really is a both
right.
and.
Sure.
Like you can
Mm,
be both, you can both have rules and validate emotions. You can
mm,
enforce those limits and you can validate the frustration around that. Um, in if you just lean on either or one, either one of those sides, it's not going to turn out well. I think that's pretty
yeah.
clear at this point.
Yeah. And there's
Not to
so
say
much
that like
research.
yeah, not to say that like
Yeah.
authoritarian, not like truly like punitive, but just,
Right.
more like rule setting, rule abiding. Yeah.
Exactly. No, I
Yeah.
get that. And, there is so much research around the fact that children need sensitive responses. Like the responsiveness is so important. And I see that, and I've shared that with parents. And what's
Mm.
interesting is that parents and a lot of dads have asked me, what does it mean to respond in a sensitive way to a child? Like, what am I just
Mm,
saying that it's okay that they're mad? What does it look like? And now that
mm,
I've read your book, I've made the connection in terms of how to support them, right? Because in the
yeah.
end, it's that exact thing. It's the validation piece. But so many
Yes.
dads that I've worked with and spoken with, and you alluded to this before, if we weren't raised in that environment, if we don't know what it sounds like, what
Of
it
course not.
feels like, then it's going to be something new that we need to build. And a lot of dads really struggle with that for themselves and for their partners and their children as well. And
Yes.
so have you seen differences, and are there any differences between men and women?
I think so. Interestingly, however, I'll say that like a lot of my, and because I work with a lot of parents as well, and a lot of like my male clients, or um, perhaps even more stereotypically like less quote unquote emotionally intelligent, they actually
Sure.
really can take to some of this material because it
Hmm.
is so like that's something that's really surprised me is
Hmm.
that a lot of my guys pick this up pretty quickly because it
Right.
is like an algorithm, like you learn it. It's a if
Yeah.
then if this then that. And so
Right.
I think that there's capacity there. I also think as soon as you show, as soon as you validate somebody and you have them step back and look at how that made them feel, and then you say, okay, is that this is what I'm talking about giving your child, right? It's not about who's right or wrong. It's just about
Exactly.
seeing what is. And
Mm,
another, I think, really important thing to reflect on for parents who are like, am I doing the right thing? I'm doing everything wrong when it comes to this like permissive versus not.
mm,
Like all of that research on invalidation was around like invalidating kids' emotions. Okay. Challenging ineffective behavior is a different story.
mm,
So, just like really basic, if this is all very confusing, validate your kids' emotions and feel free to challenge or correct behavior within reason. Okay. None of this like punitive, violent punishment stuff, but,
yeah.
short timeouts, what have you.
Mm.
That is. That is what we're talking about here.
Yeah, yeah. And I always ask my kids, I have 3 kids, they're 5, 7, and 9. I'll say, what could
Oh
you have
my.
said differently to your brother or sister, right? Like, or what could you have
Yeah.
done differently? And so it's validating the emotion in that moment. I understand that you got frustrated, but next time this happens, because it will, what can you say differently to make sure that they don't get as upset or they don't get frustrated as well, right? And so we
Yes.
have to have these kinds of conversations.
Yeah, I'm a big fan
Yeah,
of it's okay to be frustrated, it's not okay to yell. Or
of
it's okay
course.
to be
Yeah, I love
disappointed,
that.
it's not okay to what. So I'm really
Yeah,
focusing on like your emotion is valid, the behavior is not. Is
yeah.
is basically the shorthand.
I absolutely love this. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with
Yeah,
us. I enjoyed this conversation. I wish we could
likewise.
go on more. I recommend this book for everyone who's listening. I'm going to put the link in the show notes. Is there anywhere else that we can reach out to you? You mentioned TikTok. Is there social media, or where are you
Yeah,
at?
golly. Yes,
We're going
I'm
to
on
follow you.
yes, TikTok, Instagram.
Yeah.
You can also, connect with me through my website. I've got behind the scenes kind of info on the book and stuff like that for folks who are interested as well.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
I guess maybe just to kind of close the conversation, a quick, thing you can try tomorrow. Is there something, that's going to
Mm.
summarize everything that we spoke about, that it could be something that they can try after they listen to this?
Yeah, the next time your kiddo comes to you with a problem, or frankly anybody, just pause for a second and ask yourself, should I respond with problem solving or validation? Problem
Mm,
solving steps in there and is trying to change, here's what you could do better to next time to get a better grade on your test. Let's call the tutor. Let's do this. These are all suggestions that are designed to change how a child is feeling. And
mm,
validation just is a moment of pause to say, "Oh man, that is so painful. That is so disappointing." As parents, we gravitate towards problem solving.
right.
And
It's true.
if you reflect on this, I think you'll find there's many more times where validation is immediately the obvious path to take if you're just a
Mm.
little bit like more mindful about it.
I love
Yeah.
that. Even just hearing you say that, if I were to hear that from a partner or a friend, there's
Yeah.
there's love that comes behind that. Like, what do you need from
Yeah.
me? You want me to help you
Yeah.
problem solve, or you just want me to validate? And you're right. Most of the time it's like, I don't want to vent, but I need you to validate that it makes sense that I'm tired today, right? Or I'm
Yeah.
frustrated
Yeah.
from this situation. It feels good to hear that.
Yeah, it's
Mm,
like, people want to I believe that we do wanna help. We really do. That's
mm,
why we problem solve. we're just not aware of the fact that, like, sometimes just letting someone sit with their pain
Yeah.
and being present for that is helpful. I
Thank you.
think
Thank
that's
you
the
so
problem.
much. Thank
Yeah,
you,
thank
Carolyn. I
you.
really
This was
appreciate it.
lovely.
Thank you. Take care. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Carolyn as much as I did. If you haven't done so yet, make sure you are subscribed to the podcast and please share this with friends and colleagues and family members. Here are two studies that I found. I got curious about the topic of validation and wanted to find studies that can support this whole idea of why validation is so important and why invalidation is also important for us to understand. And so there was a study that I wanted to highlight. So the first one is a study by Adrian and colleagues in 2018. It's a little bit older, but very significant. So it's the outcome or the takeaway from this particular study. By the way, these two studies that I'm talking about, the link is in the show notes. The links are in the show notes. So how we respond to our child's emotions can literally shape their mental health. Let me repeat that. How we respond to our child's emotions literally shapes their mental health, which is why Curious Neuron exists. So, in this study, researchers observed teens at high risk of self harm and found that parental invalidation, so dismissing an emotion, minimizing an emotion, or reacting inconsistently to a child's emotions once they become teens, this was a strong predictor of self-harm behaviors. And so we have to remember how important our response and reaction to our kids' emotions is. What was even more surprising from this study is that if you say, okay, well, maybe I do invalidate, but I do validate sometimes. Well, this study found that the parents that did both invalidated and validated their child's emotions, because they were invalidating, the validating was not even outweighing the invalidation. And that's how impactful invalidating is. And if some of you are listening to this saying, hey, I know I was invalidated throughout my childhood, I get it. It is very easy to fall in a cycle of invalidating because we were invalidated and we don't know what that sounds like or feels like or looks like. And that's the second study that I wanted to highlight for you. And so, in another study by Lee and colleagues in 2021, this was a very powerful study that found that emotional invalidation isn't just harmful in the moment, it can echo across generations. So, in the study of nearly 300 families that they evaluated and tested, parents who were invalidated as children were more likely to invalidate their children themselves, especially when they struggled with emotion regulation skills. And so, coupling the fact that I don't know how to cope with my own emotions, I'm probably not validating my emotional experience. And so, how can I validate and support my child with their emotions in an emotional moment? And so, mothers who experienced emotional invalidation as kids often lacked the tools to regulate their own feelings, which made it harder to respond supportively to their children's emotions. I cannot stress enough how important it is for us to learn how to regulate our emotions. And when we start to do that, it becomes easier for us to help our child regulate, which changes their behavior, which supports and protects their future mental health. I've said it over and over again, and these two studies highlight just how important that is. And so if you're listening to this saying, I'm pretty sure I'm the kind of parent who invalidates, it's not too late. You can start now, but what's important is that you will have to not flip flop between validating and invalidating, that you will have to make a very conscious decision of pausing when your child has an emotion. This is a good way to catch yourself. Say it in your head first. First, learn what validation is. And then when something happens with your child, pause, say it in your mind, and ask yourself, is this validating or invalidating? And make sure you stick to the validating kind of script and language with your child to validate their emotions. And remember, you have to validate the valid. So if you are a parent listening to this saying, great, this was all important and I have no idea what to do, come join us inside the Reflective Parent Club. Education is not enough. It's only the beginning. Education coupled with having a platform, a space to speak up, to share what you're trying to work on or you don't know how to build the awareness around something, that's how you start making a difference in yourself. That's where you start seeing your own personal growth that will lead to you not just being a better parent, but being a better version, not even just a better version of yourself, but when you work on yourself, you see the difference not only in your well-being and your stress levels, but in the relationships around you. And so that is why the Reflective Parent Club exists. That is why Curious Neuron exists and this podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Everything you need is in the show notes, including a freebie that I have. So if you often get triggered by your child, go grab that freebie in the show notes below. And you can also visit curiousneuron.com. I put the link down in the show notes for the blog post associated with this. You can keep learning with us and you can come join us inside the Reflective Parent Club. I'll see you next week. Bye.